I long feared the answer to the question, is drinking coffee ethical? I love coffee. I want to do what's good and right for the world, and I strive to do so. I'm deliberate about making sure the food that I eat and the clothes that I wear and the car that I drive are ethical. But when it comes to coffee, if it's bad to drink coffee, I don't want to know about it. Well, curiosity eventually won out, and I now know the answer. And I will tell you what it is, but please bear with me while I set some context for this important question. My relationship with coffee goes way back to visiting with my grandparents on the farm when I was a kid. Coffee time was very important. Everyone came together around the table for coffee and cookies. Even at a young age, I knew that this ritual was about a lot more than the brown stuff that the adults drank. Although it was called coffee time, it wasn't really about coffee. It was really about belonging, even if you were drinking green Kool-Aid. That's what coffee still is for me. Whenever I'm drinking coffee, I am almost always doing it with people I really like to be with. People that I belong to and people that belong to me. Okay, it's also about the caffeine, but mostly it's about that belonging thing. I was watching an episode of How It's Made. It was about coffee.
Coffee boasts over 800 flavor characteristics.
At least double those of wine. And it's amazing that our senses can discern all these complex flavors. We extract those flavors by various means. The most common in coffee houses is the espresso. That's espresso, not espresso. That's when a small amount of nearly boiling water is forced under pressure through finely ground coffee. And then the human creator fulfills the mandate to innovate. The variations to the making of an espresso include lungo with more water and ristretto with less. You can add water to make an Americano, steamed milk to make a latte, lots of steamed milk to make a macchiato, and equal parts espresso, steamed milk, and froth milk to make a cappuccino. And each of these has variations as well. Thousands of variations. I drink lungo cafe in the morning to get things going, and then an Americano black. The cultural variations for the enjoyment of coffee are many. Consider the Ethiopian coffee ceremony. The coffee ceremony can take hours. While you sit with your friends and family, the raw beans are roasted, and that fills the room with the smell of freshly roasted coffee. The woman preparing the coffee uses a wooden pestle and mortar to grind the coffee, and then she stirs it into these black earthen coffee pots to steep. The pouring of the coffee requires grace and skill. To further diffuse the aroma through the room, the woman pours the coffee in one continuous stream over a foot above these small handleless cups. It falls to the youngest child to announce that the coffee is ready and to serve it, starting with the eldest member of those who will partake. 3 rounds of coffee are served with stories and conversation. The last cup is called Arabica. It's the cup of blessing. It is possible to come as a visitor to a simple peasant hut in Ethiopia and be treated with some of the best coffees of the world. The pleasure we derive from the complex flavors of coffee, the cultural variations of enjoying the coffee, and the communities in which we drink coffee are all a part of coffee's created goodness. But in some significant ways, we've taken all this goodness and degraded it. The forces of hell don't like pleasure or variety or community, so they obviously don't like coffee. In the Screwtape letters, C.S. Lewis reveals the demonic view of pleasure. An experienced demon, Screwtape, offers advice to his nephew, a novice tempter, on the use of pleasure to ensnare the human soul. He tells him, "You must always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure, to that in which it is least natural, least redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable." He says that when dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. That's God's territory. For Screwtape, the demonic formula for the distortion of any pleasure is an ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure. For a long time in North America, the demonic forces have been working very hard on corrupting the pleasures of coffee, making us need it more and making sure we derive less and less pleasure from it. I first started drinking coffee in university. My mother had sent me off to school with the essentials: 15 pairs of underwear with my name written on the waistbands with laundry pen, and a little 2-cup kettle for boiling water. At some point, I picked up a little jar of Taster's Choice instant coffee. My coffee consumption was strictly utilitarian. I drank it to stay sharp while writing papers and when cramming for exams. I didn't particularly like the taste, so I drank it with lots of sugar and non-dairy creamer. So let's talk about instant coffee. It's pretty convenient. It requires only a spoon, a cup, and some hot water. Instant coffee is, as they say, of the devil. But it's great for corporate profits. Because the process of making instant coffee creates such a poor-tasting coffee anyway, cheap, poor-quality beans can be used. Instant coffee production extracts twice the coffee stuff from the beans as does the creation of a regular coffee. So the same amount of beans goes twice as far. Unfortunately, this over-extraction results in a bitter and aromaless product. Okay, now this is interesting. I remember the commercials for Nestle Sunrise Instant Coffee.
This is coffee, roasted in a coffee oven to its peak of perfection. This is chicory, roasted in the same coffee oven to its peak of perfection.
Carefully blended, you get Sunrise Instant Coffee, mellowed with chicory.
Mellowed with chicory. Chicory is an adulterant. The main reason it's used is that it's cheaper than coffee, even the bad stuff. So by adding it to the ground coffee, the price can be dropped to increase sales. And that increases profits. So chicory isn't the only adulterant added to coffee over the years. In his book Uncommon Grounds, Mark Pendergrass offers an amazing list of adulterants. I suppose that parsnips and pea hulls aren't so bad when one considers baked horse liver and brick dust. But by principle, chicory is no different than burnt rags and coal ashes, or dirt and dog biscuits. The fundamental principle is the increase of profit margins. Although this list comes from the Industrial Revolution, the motivation behind the addition of adulterants to coffee seems to be alive and well with these coffee producers. Chicory. Cheap coffee means more coffee sold, and that means more profits.
The best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup.
Well, that's a lie on so many levels. At work, we used to drink whatever was on sale at Costco. Sometimes we had Folgers. Procter & Gamble's promotional material, back then at least, it said that the classic roast is a blend of Arabica and Robusta beans for a smooth, full-bodied flavor. You got that right. They make this little blend sound like a good thing. Without it, it seems, we would not have that smooth, full-bodied flavor. There are two reasons to blend Robusta with Arabica. One reason is simply taste. Robusta is more earthy and less acidic and fruity than Arabica. Good quality Robusta beans mixed with Arabica can be a good thing, because it tastes a little different. But there's an awful lot of poor quality Robusta out there, and you don't find good quality anything in the so-called canned coffee. And the more Robusta the canned coffee companies can get away with grinding into that big can of coffee, the cheaper the coffee and the higher the profits. So the second reason to include Robusta is to make cheaper coffee. Arabica and Robusta beans. Let me tell you about these two different types of coffee beans. Approaches to coffee cultivation lie on a continuum between the traditional shade-grown coffee and the more modern unshaded monoculture. The first is carried out at higher elevations, under a canopy of trees where there is a constant replenishment of organic material as the leaf litter decomposes. The trees are a home to an array of beneficial insects and birds that act to control potential pests. The unshaded monoculture, on the other hand, demands the removal of all organisms but the coffee plants. These are set out by the thousands in rows upon rows that stretch for miles. This method allows for efficiencies like mechanized harvesting, but it also results in environmental degradation. Water pollution, soil erosion, declines in local fish populations due to sedimentation, and bird populations because of loss of trees, increased soil and air temperatures, and lower amounts of moisture and microorganisms in the soil. The problems that directly affect the coffee production are solved by the application of chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, chemical fungicides, and chemical herbicides. The Arabica variety grows at high altitudes, and its beans develop more slowly, and there aren't as many of them as Robusta. Robusta grows at lower elevations, its beans develop quickly, and there are lots of them. When it comes to flavor, Arabica beans are superior in every way. From a commercial perspective, Robusta beans are superior in every way. The mechanized Robusta plantations will outproduce traditional Arabica shade farms by as much as 4 times per acre. The result is a vastly inferior tasting cup of coffee and a lot more profit. You can buy a 3-pound can of Folgers Classic Roast at Costco for $12.99 Canadian. Historically, North Americans have insisted on cheap coffee. It doesn't have to be good, but it must be cheap. And the big coffee companies are happy to oblige. In an online discussion, the question was asked, which coffee do you like best? Here's one of the replies. While I love Starbucks as much as the next person, the reality is I will not pay the price for it on a daily basis. Buying it in a bag for home is just as expensive. I can buy a huge container of Folgers or Maxwell House for $7 at Walmart, whereas the little Starbucks bag costs about the same. For many, price is a significant factor in what coffee one drinks. We pay very little for our coffee. If you brewed canned coffee at home, the coffee is costing you a lot less than $0.25 per cup. If you buy a fancy latte at Starbucks, the coffee portion of your beverage doesn't cost a whole lot more than $0.25. So we don't pay much for the coffee part of our coffee. And the companies that transport, roast, and package the coffee for us aren't paying for it either. They are enjoying healthy profits. It's the farmers who are paying the bulk of the cost for our coffee. World coffee prices are volatile. Low coffee prices had a lot to do with the large surplus of Robusta and poor quality Arabica being produced by huge coffee plantations in Vietnam and Brazil. When prices are low, farmers get less for their coffee than the cost of its production. Consequently, throughout the coffee-growing world, desperate farmers abandon their trees and look for work elsewhere, while their families sometimes live under plastic tarps by the roadside. Some daughters resort to prostitution to support their families. Other farmers have burned their coffee plants and replaced them with drug crops like coca in the Americas or khat in Africa. You know what this means? Don't drink coffee made from Robusta or poor quality Arabica beans. In other words, don't drink cheap canned coffee. You will have to pay more for your coffee. The good news is your coffee will taste a lot better. It's a win-win. Believe it or not, when coffee prices rose sharply in the 1950s, congressional hearings were held to investigate the reason behind the increases. Some were blaming the producers of taking advantage of the defenseless coffee drinkers. The documentary film Black Coffee has a speech made by congressional witness Andreas Arube. He explains the sudden price rise was because of a shortage of coffee. He pointed out that most of the money Americans paid for their coffee did not go to Latin American producers, but to U.S. roasters, retailers, and restaurants. Irube said, "Gentlemen, when you are dealing with coffee, you are not dealing only with a commodity, a convenience. You are dealing with the lives of millions of people. We in Latin America have a task before us which is staggering to the imagination. Illiteracy to be eliminated, disease to be wiped out, good health to be restored, a sound program of nutrition to be worked out for millions of people. The key to all of this is an equitable price for coffee. Otherwise, you cast these millions of persons loose to drift in a perilous sea of poverty and privation, subject to every chilling wind, every subversive blast." His words had no effect. Big coffee companies are the real enemy of coffee growers, the environment, and the consumer. They promote and provide a market for poor quality Arabica and Robusta beans, the production of which is not environmentally sustainable and thus drive down the global price of coffee. This can ruin lives and the environment. If this doesn't motivate you, it also threatens the production of Arabica coffee beans, the good ones. In other words, it literally threatens the quality of the coffee in your cup. So what can we do? One of the things you can do is to look for those certification symbols on the coffee labels. Various organizations have begun to certify producers and label coffee according to standards of stewardship. For those who want to drink coffee that doesn't hurt the environment or the people who produce it, these labels help direct them to ethical coffee. The fair trade label indicates that the producers and the workers in developing countries have received a fair price for their coffee and a fair wage for their labor. The certified organic label means that the coffee wasn't grown using pesticides, chemical fertilizers, or genetically modified seeds. Bird-friendly and Rainforest Alliance certified shade-grown coffee labels mean that the coffee was grown using traditional methods so that the trees on coffee plantations are preserved rather than clear-cut. Rainforest Alliance has begun to certify coffee producers who raise coffee in areas that have been deforested if these producers are pursuing a program to return the trees into these clear cuts and cultivating coffee in their shade. There is another way that you can be reasonably assured that your coffee is produced ethically. Simply drink great coffee. The idea here is to pay a higher price for a higher quality, and by doing so, rewarding the most committed growers. Great coffee is not grown in the full sun of a clear cut and doused with chemicals. Great coffee requires great care at every step of the process. There's a wonderful principle at work here. The best coffee is produced using methods and means that respect the people who grow it and the environment in which it is grown. It's as if justice and natural law have been fused. Do you drink coffee at work? If you're not drinking good coffee, share this video with your boss and get rid of that canned garbage. What about your church or your social club? A friend of mine, let's call her Suzanne, has been to Honduras on numerous occasions. She did so as a member of her church's missions team. She was struck by the poverty she saw there. In order to eat, entire families worked on the coffee plantations long hours, and they were paid almost nothing. Suzanne believes that if the adults received an adequate wage, the young children would be able to go to school, and the cycle of poverty would be broken. The missions team, believing that serving ethical coffee was essential to supporting the coffee-producing communities, like those in Honduras, convinced the church leadership to switch to fair trade coffee. But after a time, Suzanne's church began a large building project. There was an overall increase in donations, but less was directed to church ministries. Cuts were necessary, and they switched back to canned coffee. Residents of Abbotsford, BC, where I live, are the most generous people in Canada. Their contribution to charities is more than double the national average. One explanation is that the community is very religious. My experience with the religious community in Abbotsford is that they will, in a flash, write a check to help a school in Nicaragua or a water project in Ethiopia. But then they will go home after church and they'll make a pot of coffee from a can, not realizing how much they could help those very communities by switching to ethical coffee. They think that buying a cheaper product is good stewardship, but it's actually the opposite. What about Starbucks? Starbucks has good coffee. If you are concerned with the social and environmental effects of coffee production, your choice between buying Starbucks or a corporate canned coffee is clear. Buy Starbucks. Starbucks deserves some thanks. Although I think it was unintentional, they have helped the plight of the coffee grower. In their quest for profits, they have given us in North America a taste for good quality coffee. When I had my first sip of Starbucks, I thought it was too strong and bitter. By the time I finished the cup, I realized there was so much more to coffee than caffeine. I realized I loved coffee. It was Starbucks that helped me to see coffee as more than a caffeine delivery system. And by introducing me to good coffee, they put me on a quest for a great one. But to whom should Starbucks be compared? If you are comparing Starbucks to a small roaster, again, the choice is clear. Don't buy Starbucks. Go to the small roaster. Because there are so many good coffees to experience, it seems a shame to limit oneself to Starbucks Pike Place blend. My biggest knock on Starbucks is the homogenization of the coffee drinking experience. In Rome, I drank coffee in 3 different shops in the same morning. The differences were awesome, and they added to the experience. Since when did conformism become a core American value so that the coffee shop needs to look exactly the same in Seattle as it does in Soho? Or worse yet, the same in Vegas as it does in Venice? And don't even get me started on the topic of designing our church lobbies to resemble Starbucks. The Starbucksification of the church. I'll probably make a video about that sometime. Please subscribe. I'll just say this. When we try to imitate Starbucks, people will eventually figure out that Starbucks does Starbucks better than the church does, and they'll go to Starbucks. Final word. In 1999, I watched a bandana mask protester heave a USA Today newspaper box through the window of a Starbucks during the World Trade Organization riots in Seattle. At the time, I was disgusted by the lack of respect for property and authority, but one question lingered. What are they so mad about? Since then, I have heard things. Dark whisperings about coffee and third world exploitation, and I didn't want to hear them because I didn't want to quit coffee. But I also desire to do what's right and good, so I plucked up my courage and endeavored here to find out if there is such a thing as an ethical cup of coffee. It turns out there is. An ethical cup of coffee is a great cup of coffee. You're going to have to pay a little more for it, but what's wrong with that? You're the one that's drinking it. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.